Good morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Pringle from the UK Climate Impacts Programme and also part of the PLACARD team. And I'd like to warmly welcome you to the Monitoring and Evaluation to Enhance Adaptation and Reduce Disaster Risk webinar run by the PLACARD team. We've got a number of members of the PLACARD team involved in the webinar as well, so I'll just briefly mention Stephanie Ferguson, who's with me here in Oxford, who will be helping with the questions that you may pose during the course of the webinar. We've got Eleni, Karali, who was involved in the PLACARD team and will also be presenting, and some of the guys in Portugal at FF Cool, Mario Porcurio, who is the lead of the PLACARD team, who is supporting in the background, but you may not actually hear from him. Before we get going with the presentations, I just want to briefly mention a little bit about PLACARD. PLACARD is a Horizon 2020 project that started in 2015, and the aims of the project are to support knowledge exchange between the climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction networks, really to provide a common space where different stakeholders can share information and exchange knowledge and identify opportunities to improve collaboration. We realise that climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction often work in similar areas on similar challenges and themes, but often the connections between the two communities aren't as effective as they might be. So we're very much part of improving that process through this Horizon 2020 project. And part of this task so far, as part of our work within the PLACARD team, has been to identify areas where it might be particularly valuable to share knowledge and experience. And one of those has cropped up has been monitoring and evaluation, and this has been highlighted by a number of people, and a number of people both within DRR and CCA as an area where there's a lot of work going on and there could be potentially a lot of learning between the two communities. So the purposes of this webinar are really to explore some examples of monitoring and evaluation from both the CCA and DRR perspectives and reflect on some of the lessons that we can learn from these. Both of these communities, the DRR and CCA, are undertaking monitoring and evaluation against the backdrop of a changing climate that's really exacerbating disaster risk, it's increasing our vulnerability, and it's eroding our resilience. So we're hoping to understand a little bit more from the presenters about how they're dealing with these challenges and what we can learn from those different experiences. And in doing so, thinking a little bit more about how we can improve the connections between adaptation and DRR on this topic of M&E, and what might be the benefits of doing so, and how could we go about doing that in a very practical, meaningful way. So that's a little bit about PLACARD and about what we want to achieve from this webinar. Briefly, I'll just run you through the order of the presentations. I'll be handing over to Eleni from CMCC and part of the PLACARD team in a moment. She'll talk a little bit about her experiences working on monitoring and evaluation at national level on adaptation. I'll then pass on to Laura Schmidt from DG ECHO, and then finally on to Paula, Silva, Villanueva from Resilience Monitor to talk a little bit about her experiences with the DFID-funded BRACE project. There will be a question and answer session after each of the presentations. We'll probably keep that fairly brief, 2 or 3 questions, hopefully targeted very specifically on each of those presentations. There'll be a chance for a more general discussion at the end, time allowing. So the idea is then we can explore some of the broader challenges about M&E at the end. There's a few housekeeping points just to make before I do hand over to Eleni. The first one is that all of the microphones for all of you are turned off. And that's really because we're expecting quite a large number of participants, which is great, but it also means that there might be quite a lot of background noise if we leave those on. So we'll be turning those off. And also that the webinar will be recorded and that we'll make it available as soon as possible online. So there'll be a full recording of the whole session. Because your mics are turned off, I'd really like to still receive lots of questions and lots of thoughts, comments, views. But the best way to do that is actually by going on the chat function, which is should be on the top right of your screen. You'll see a little speech bubble that says chat. If you click on that, you will then be able to ask questions. If you select the send to part, it should be defaulted to all participants, but if for any reason it's not, just click on all participants, and then that will reach everybody and everyone will be able to see your question. If you don't feel comfortable with that and you particularly want to send them just to the panelists, that's absolutely fine as well. You can select all panelists and then we'll see your question that way, but it won't go to the whole group. So whatever you're more comfortable with, but generally happy to share with everybody. So as I say, hopefully we'll get lots and lots of questions and lots of comments. If there are ones we don't manage to raise with the panelists during the session, we will try and collate them and we'll respond to those separately afterwards, and we'll aim to sort of publish something and send you a link to that on the PLACARD website, so you can see some of the questions might require a bit more consideration, or we might just run out of time, so we will get back to you. And there's also an opportunity to contact us by email if you have any queries or questions, placard@uksit.org.uk. It's also on the slide that you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner there. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Eleni, who will tell us a little bit more about her work monitoring the evaluation at European level.
Thank you, Patrick, and a very warm welcome also from my side to everyone. Today I will be sharing some information about the national level monitoring, reporting and evaluation schemes of climate change adaptation policies as being used in Europe. This material is based on some work that we did with some colleagues of ours in the ETC-CCA, and always in collaboration with the European Environment Agency. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of the ETCs, I would like to briefly mention that these are centers of thematic expertise. So basically, they're a consortia of experts from research institutes, universities, environment agencies from all across Europe. And we carry out specific tasks that are in alignment with the EEA multi-annual and annual work programs. So in our ETC, our experts have a specialization in the area of climate change impact, vulnerability, and adaptation. So a group of us, we have been working together for the last 3 or 4 years, and we have been following the national level adaptation policy processes in Europe, publishing relevant reports almost on an annual basis. As you know, the adaptation policy is a quite dynamic field, and countries have been making progress in the last years, and changes have been taking place in a quite constant and fast rate. The same applies specifically to the area of monitoring, reporting, and evaluation activities. Just to give you an example to illustrate this, back in 2014, the EEA carried out a self-reported survey with 33 countries, and at that time, only 4 of them reported that they had reached the monitoring and evaluation phase of the adaptation policy cycle. Now, a year later, we saw a completely different picture. 14 European countries had already developed or were in the process of developing an MRE system. So monitoring and evaluation, or MRE as often called, is quite an important step in the CCA policy cycle. National adaptation strategies and plans that are milestones reached a little bit earlier in this cycle provide important information about the strategic direction or the overall vision that countries have with regards to adaptation. But what we often see is that they lack specific targets, tractable targets. And in this sense, monitoring and evaluation is quite an important step, because they can contribute to multiple relevant purposes, including, for example, the assessment of the efficiency and the effectiveness of such policies and other relevant initiatives. They can contribute or provide accountability. They can support learning, knowledge exchange, and also evidence-based policy making. So as countries go along this policy cycle and they reach more mature phases of the cycle, they tend to seek for more support for carrying out monitoring and evaluation processes in the best possible ways. We also see that countries are interested in getting information from other countries that are quite advanced in this area. So they are interested in exchanging information and learning from each other. So in response to this growing interest, back in 2015, we focused our work on national level monitoring, reporting, and evaluation in Europe. This work was published at the end of the year as an EEA technical report. The aim of the report was to provide new insights and compile information that was emerging from this field, and at the end to support policy actors that have been working in this field, basically in regards to the implementation of policy, with regards to policy implementation and action. So at that time, this report was one of the first attempts to compile this type of information, especially with focus on Europe. We use several information sources, including a workshop with experts on the area of MRE from all across Europe, and we aimed to collect information regarding the reasons why countries tend to develop such schemes, but also the purposes that they aim to achieve. We also try to understand who are the actors that are involved in the governance of these schemes, which are the methods that they have been using, and finally, if and to what extent MRE activities produce information that fit into policy making. So when it comes to the drivers and the purposes of MRE systems, we observed that there was quite a diversity across the different countries, and this diversity reflected the differences in the country's profile, so the needs, the expectations, the resources that they had available. In the workshop that I mentioned earlier, experts made it quite clear that the momentum for developing MRE systems in Europe comes from the legal and administrative requirements related to the national adaptation strategies and plans, along with other reporting requirements that come mainly from European policies and international agreements. Some of the experts also mentioned the growing occurrence of extreme events, and basically that these urged for the development of MRE systems. As I mentioned, the same diversity was observed with regards to the purposes that MRE systems aim to achieve. Tracking and reporting of the progress and effectiveness of adaptation, policy implementation, enhancement of knowledge, learning, and accountability were the four main purposes that emerged during our workshop. Then the purpose, as you might think, will have inevitably an impact on the methods that the MRE systems actually use. So when it comes to the methodological approaches that have been used in these schemes, we identified among the key messages, the key findings, that national level MRE systems can benefit from being flexible and pragmatic and having always into consideration the individualities of the different country needs and expectations. Then the mixed method approaches and the use of multiple sources of information have the potential to provide a stronger basis for the assessment of adaptation progress and performance. Qualitative and quantitative methods should be used complementarily if our aim is not only to get numbers, but also to better understand what are the narratives behind these numbers. And finally, an observation that indicators play a key role in national MRE systems. And as you can see from this table, there are many countries in Europe that have already developed or are in the process of developing indicator sets for the purpose of MRE. This was not really a surprise, but there is a strong preference, and we know that for this type of tools. And one of the main reasons is that countries at the moment are mainly focused on the monitoring and the reporting aspect of these schemes. So evaluation is seen as a task that will take place in the future, and this is mainly because the implementation of adaptation policies have been taking place for quite a short time. And indicators is indeed a tool that fits very well with the monitoring and the reporting. Also, when we take a closer look at the indicators that have been implemented so far, we see that although qualitative indicators have been applied, the great majority of them are quantitative indicators. And this, again, results from the fact that quantitative indicators are more likely easier to conceptualize and implement, but they can also support a better communication. This is something that policymakers really appreciate. Then we were also interested in seeing whether the MRE activities produce information and fit into policymaking. At the time that we were developing our report, there was actually limited experience of application of the monitoring and evaluation results. And the examples that we managed to find were from they were related with the more advanced countries and were associated with the revision of adaptation strategies and plans. Nevertheless, even from these examples, we were not really in place to really understand what if and to what extent MRE results had a strong influence in these processes. Nevertheless, as countries become more advanced in this area, we expect that more and more evidence will become available, and we expect also that the numbers of such examples will increase in the future. I also mentioned earlier that in this report we looked at the policy actors that are involved in the governance of FRA schemes. This is a quite complex theme, and I purposefully decided not to include it in today's presentation because I thought that it would take probably most of the time that we had available for this presentation today. However, I would strongly encourage those of you who are interested in this area to have a look at our report. It provides some very interesting information about governance. And just the final remark before I finish with today's presentation is that MRE is actually an area of interest both for the EDC and the EEA. And we have maintained this interest even beyond the publication of the 2015 technical report. In 2016, we prepared an EDC working paper where we presented some of the lessons learned from the implementation of MRE system in other policy domains beyond adaptation. And also this year, we are going to focus our work on developing a database with adaptation indicators as these have been implemented in different European countries. Also having in mind the overall objective of today's webinar, thinking that this is actually an opportunity to bring together people that work in DRR and CCA fields. I would like to mention that the EEA is planning to publish this year a report that is looking in these two fields. And among other objectives that this report aims to achieve is also the improvement of knowledge exchange between the two of these two domains. So we are really excited about this publication, and we are looking forward to it. And I would also would like to share this information to you so that you're aware, and hopefully you will find it also as interesting as we do. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleni. That was really interesting. Just now, we're just looking across to see if we have any questions, and there's one that's come in from Daniel Osberghaus, who has a question. Can you give an example of a qualitative adaptation indicator?
That's a very good question. And I need to actually go back to the report. I cannot remember one right now, but I will certainly come back to you on this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very helpful. I think certainly the work that we undertook on this topic, it really came through quite strongly that the need to combine both the qualitative and the quantitative, and often if you like, the conventional indicators at a national level seem to be more quantitative in their nature, but then they were very much complemented, not necessarily just by indicators, but by a range of qualitative information, whether that's testing with experts and getting their views on changing resilience or changing vulnerability, or by actually in some cases trying to understand exactly how specific communities or specific sectors are affected through interviews and other techniques. So yeah, I'm sure there's some specific examples that Eleni will be able to provide you with later on once she's had a chance to refer back to that report. So thank you for the question. Are there any more questions? I don't think there are any more at the moment. I just have a quick one for you, Eleni. It was interesting that extreme weather was named as an important driver for countries that are looking at M&E. Was there any mention of that in the context of disasters? Because obviously extreme weather is an area that is relevant to both communities. I was wondering whether there was any specific attempt to link with DRR.
Well, basically, the experts mentioned that there is an urgency for adaptation action. So they basically wanted to understand who is responsible for dealing with extreme weather events or how countries can tackle better with them. So what they mentioned is that they saw MRE system as an opportunity to collect evidence for responding to such questions. So to some extent, there is even an indirect relation with DRR, but there was not an explicit reference, at least in the context of the workshop that we carried out.
Okay, and I guess a related thought I had was the extent to which loss data was considered, because obviously that's a strong consideration for the DRR community, but did that come through in the way they were looking to evaluate adaptation at national level?
Not explicitly, at least.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bert. Thanks
and
to you.
If others do have any questions, specifically for Eleni, that crop into their heads as we go through the webinar, please just do put it in the chat function. In fact, we do have one more. I'll just take a look now. From Helen Scott. Although the report focuses on national level monitoring and reporting, does it look at different scales of government reporting, such as local government or regional government? Eleni, can I bring you back in for that one?
Yes. In the report, we looked at, as you mentioned, Helen, correctly, at national level reporting. Nevertheless, we try to identify for different countries that we use as examples, of course, the actors that are involved in the governance and MRE schemes, but also looking at other levels rather than the national one. So again, regional government, ministries were mentioned as some of the key actors that took part in the organization or in the implementation of MRE schemes. So we looked at different phases of the MRE organization and implementation, and we try to identify the actors that were associated with each of these different phases. And yes, if you're interested in that, we can actually further discuss about it, but certainly in the report there are quite a few examples, so you can also have a look at that too for more details in this area.
Great. Well, thank you for those questions, and thanks for your response, Eleni, very helpful. Now I'd like to move on to the second presentation, which is from Laura Schmidt from DG ECHO. Laura, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try and share my presentation. Don't know if you can see it yet. Can you see the presentation?
No, we can't see it yet.
Okay. I don't know if you can send me the invitation again. Oh, sorry, maybe here, share.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay,
yep.
great.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Yes, so my name is Laura Schmidt. I work for the Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection DG here in Brussels. So I will be presenting mainly what we do on the DRR or disaster prevention side in terms of the monitoring and evaluation. And just because it's obviously quite a diverse audience, I wanted to start by giving you a brief background on the legislative tools that we have, on the main legislative tools that we're actually building this on, and then go into the specific monitoring and evaluation tools that we use. And I think I'll be picking up on quite a few things that were already mentioned, like lost data, sharing of best practice, quantitative assessments, and so on. So I'm just going to show you briefly who's involved in the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, which is the main tool that we have for disaster response, preparedness, but also prevention. So there's a whole prevention chapter in that specific mechanism, and it covers both natural and also man-made disasters. So there's obviously kind of larger scale in terms of the disasters than what you'd normally be looking at if you're doing pure climate change adaptation, because we also cover the man-made disasters. And as you can see as well, the mechanism actually covers more countries than just the EU countries, because other neighboring countries can join on a voluntary basis. So we currently have Norway, Iceland, Turkey, and then 3 Balkan countries, which are Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia as well. And just to show you briefly a couple of areas that we cover, just to give you a kind of first idea of where the monitoring and evaluation aspects come in. So this is the preparedness side of activities that we do, and I have highlighted in red a couple of things that have these more post-event or evaluative aspects already. So we've got exercises, we do lessons learned, and we also finance projects that support preparedness and also prevention. And this is a prevention slide. So here I want to just give you a slightly longer introduction. So we have risk assessments. We also work with member states on risk management capability assessments, and I'm going to come back to those 2 things later on because they're really key in terms of the evaluation and monitoring of disaster prevention that we do. We also finance peer reviews. We do work with member states on sharing of best practice. That's also specifically mentioned in the legislation under various points. So it covers a lot of activities in terms of the disaster risk management. We've also built or started in 2015 a knowledge center on disaster risk management, and that's something that we run together with the European Commission's research arm, the Joint Research Center. And there we're trying to both pool kind of disaster risk management knowledge, and that would include anything to do with monitoring. But we also offer support service for member states. So with specific technical needs, member states can come to this knowledge center and we can give kind of very punctual or ad hoc rather support. So that could be kind of projects that take a couple of months to build up a database, or it could be much longer term to help them develop things like risk management capability assessments. I've also put here the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction because while that's not specifically mentioned in the legislation as such, that's obviously extremely important for us now. And we have developed the Sendai framework action plan at EU level that I'm going to come back to later on. And that's one of the key things, I would say, in terms of monitoring the policy implementation for us. And we also, under the heading of disaster proofing EU policy and funding, we're also, let's say, mainstreaming disaster risk reduction considerations into other legislative and programming tools at EU level. So that again helps, for example, to risk-proof investments under the regional funds. So you have a picture of a port there. So in theory, if a member state got funding for a port and they wanted to risk-proof that, they could get additional funding for that by showing that they have carried out a risk assessment in that particular area. Okay, so those were the main, let's say, policy areas that we had. So now I wanted to specifically introduce the monitoring and evaluation obligations that we cover. And here I think it's just important, I just wanted to mention that in the legislation itself, there is actually a specific objective, which is to achieve a high level of protection against disasters by preventing or reducing their potential effects, by fostering a culture of prevention, and by improving cooperation between civil protection and other relevant services. So that's the objective we have in the legislation. And this is actually measured through indicators. And the two key indicators we have by law are progress in the number of member states with risk assessments, which is the third bullet point you have here. So member states have to make available, oh sorry, that's the second one, sorry. So it's the risk assessments, and member states have to make available a risk assessment to the Commission. The first one was due in December 2015, and now they will have to do this exercise, or at least submit a risk assessment every 3 years. They're obviously free to do it as often as they like. So some are on an annual cycle now, some have decided to go for a 4-year cycle, for example, to give a bit more space for, let's say, more long-term developments to come through and take shape. And that they have to submit to the Commission. And we can see already that a lot of progress has been made between the situation that was in place before the legislation came in and now. So in 2014, we did a risk overview of the EU, and we got 14 risk assessments on a voluntary basis. And last December, December 2 years ago now, or a year and a half, in December 2015, we actually had all of the risk assessments, or the summaries of the risk assessments. So there clearly we can see already some of that progress that the legislation talks about. However, going back to Eleni's point about the qualitative versus the quantitative monitoring, it's clear that in purely quantitative terms we've met the target, but qualitatively the risk assessments are very different. So that's something that we will need to be thinking about now together with member states, and obviously that will also develop between now and the next deadline, so in this current cycle, because some member states have done this exercise for many years and they have a very mature risk assessment that's often many, many pages long in countries like the UK or the Netherlands, whereas others who've just maybe recently started, for example, have very short risk assessments that are mainly, let's say, kind of first shot at developing a methodology, maybe identifying 2, 3, 4 key scenarios that they want to look at. So we've got to quantitatively, if you look at them, the actual content is there's still very wide variance between what we've received, but clearly progress has been made and everybody's working on this. And the next deliverable for member states will be this risk management capability assessment. It will be a self-assessment, so it's a kind of self-monitoring, if you like, and it's due next summer. And this year we'll be working quite a lot with member states on how they can deliver that. So I think that would be also for us an interesting learning experience, because here really for the vast majority of member states it's the first time they actually do this. And what we mean by capability is broadly the technical capability, the administrative capability, and also the financial capability of dealing with the risks that they have ideally identified previously in their risk assessment. So it's a kind of block that should build on the risk assessment that they've already done. Okay, so those are the two main indicators, and then I've added here as well the lessons learned, which is actually a process that's mainly focused on response, but because the lessons learned or lessons identified, as people sometimes say to me, because it's not always clear they're actually learned, but the lessons learned can have a much wider range. So it's generally response-based, but it can kind of go back all the way to preventive and steps on preparedness. And also the last point here, and I'll explain it in a bit more detail in the next slide, is the midterm evaluation, which we're doing this year. Okay, so on the risk assessment, risk management capability assessments, I've already spoken about that quite a lot, I think. So then here, the lessons learned as well. And I just wanted to give you now a kind of idea of what the midterm evaluation will do. Again, that's a requirement we have under the legislation. So it was put in at the start. We're now halfway through the kind of current multi-annual financing framework and the life of this particular piece of legislation. So we're doing evaluation, which is due by June 2017. And for all kinds of evaluations carried out at EU level, the factors to take into account are relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, coherence, and EU added value. So is there actually any point in acting on this at EU level? And here, I think, in terms of particularly what we're discussing today, I think it's mainly the effectiveness that would be of interest. We don't have any results yet from that. I know that some of the colleagues who are here today, they will be interviewed as well, for example, for this evaluation. It does also include some questions that relate to climate change adaptation, because climate change adaptation is mentioned in our legislation. That, for example, where member states write risk assessments, they should, where possible, or as far as possible, take into account climate change considerations or climate change adaptation activities. So there's clearly a link there in terms of the effects that the risk assessment should have as well. Okay, and then I just wanted to maybe introduce a second aspect, which is the kind of soft tools, let's say. So far I've mainly spoken about actual legislative requirements that member states and or the commissions have to fulfill. We're legally bound by what's in the legislation, clearly. But the legislation also includes other tools that are either voluntary or are a little bit softer, but that I would think would also fall or serve to help us monitor and evaluate the legislation. So first of all, we have peer reviews, which are at the moment one of our key tools for the exchange of best practice that Eleni already mentioned, and that's clearly very important when you're thinking about climate change adaptation activities and also disaster risk reduction activities. So under the peer reviews, a team of experts goes to a country and they review their disaster risk management system, or sometimes they're more specific, for example, on risk assessments, but they usually include quite a lot of looking at the actual practices that the member states has it been effective, what's working well, what's not working so well, and the reports that come out at the end identify quite a lot of best practices. And at the same time, we've also found that the experts that go to, so let's say expert from country B that goes to country A, can also share a lot of what's happening in country B. So there's really a lot of mutual exchange of information. And it's been one of the most useful aspects of these peer reviews, actually. And we've had very, very good feedback from the peers themselves. So they find it very useful as well. But I've put it under the soft tools because it's voluntary. So the country that's reviewed has to invite such a review. So they have to be open also to share the information on what they've actually done. It's not obligatory. Disaster loss data, I'm actually going to leave to the end because I want to say a little bit more on that. So then we have the Knowledge Center Support Service, which I already mentioned briefly. So there we offer for countries that have identified a specific need to give them technical support to reach a certain level. And there, while it's focused on DRM, and we've supported a lot of projects that have helped countries with their risk assessments, and also with developing disaster loss databases. So it's mainly related to disaster risk management, but I think certainly for some of them, for example, in the risk assessments, there's certainly climate change adaptation considerations that come into it. And lastly, I've put the project and exchange of experts, which again are programs that we finance so that they're voluntary. The countries can either participate or not, or they can submit projects, proposals under a call or not. But again, it's usually centered around priorities that we set, and most countries that participate have found this very, very useful. It's a lot of exchange of best practice among the countries, and also for the projects in particular, we have had, for example, a lot of projects on urban resilience, and there very, very clearly there's a strong link to climate change adaptation. So we've worked quite a lot of that also at regional and local level. And then maybe just lastly on the disaster loss data. So I think it was Patrick, you put a question on that for the climate change adaptation. And I would say for us, this has been a huge area of work in the last couple of years. And then at the end of last year, there were indicators agreed, global indicators, under the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And that's because the framework itself actually includes 7 targets. So all the signatories of the Sendai Framework, they have signed up to 7 targets to meet these targets by 2030, generally speaking. And there's one target already in 2020, by which there's supposed to be more countries that have disaster risk reduction strategies in place. And all the other targets are by 2030, and they relate mainly to reducing losses, reducing loss of life, economic loss, and damage. So clearly all these are very kind of quantitative targets, or targets that lend themselves to quantitative monitoring. And there we now have global indicators as a common base for everybody. So I don't know if that's an advantage in terms of what the current situation is in climate change adaptation, but clearly it gives us a very good base also on which we hope later to compare more easily the actual loss data, because what we see now is that some member states have databases already, but they're not always using the same indicators or same baselines or measuring the same thing. So it's very difficult actually to compare. And having these global indicators will actually make the comparison a lot easier as well. And again, I think ultimately that should serve the countries that are hoping to reduce their disaster losses and improve their resilience. And maybe just lastly, at EU level, we're also supporting member states in that. We've developed a Sendai Framework Action Plan at EU level, and at the moment that's just up to 2020. And there we also have some kind of monitoring aspects, or let's say we've got the baseline and we've put what exactly we want to achieve. So we're also going to be assessing ourselves a little bit on what we can deliver for the countries. And I think I'm going to stop there. I saw a few questions popping up, I think, but I didn't have time to catch them. So maybe you can help me and remind me of what the questions were. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Laura. That was very, very useful, very informative. Just a quick comment before I go to the questions. I think the peer review aspect is really interesting, and it's something that hasn't really been picked up at national level for adaptation yet. The European Environment Agency convened a really interesting workshop as part of that report that Eleni presented on, which is the first time really pulling together the experts who are working on M&E, and it was a really useful exchange of opinions and views and perspectives. And a more formal peer review process, I think, would be really useful. So that's probably something where the adaptation community could learn a lot from that process. Now, coming on to some questions, there's a few here. Let me just scan through them. First of all, from Mike Harley. Here's a question. In using risk assessment as an indicator, are you looking at the process of undertaking the assessment or the output of the assessment having been completed?
On a purely legalistic level is the process. So what we have to check, the actual indicator is just the existence of a risk assessment. So we're not assessing how effective it's actually been, or whether, for example, it's actually linked to subsequent planning and so on. But as I said, I think through, as a next step, bringing in already this risk management capability assessment, I think we will be moving towards that a little bit more, because once you start assessing your capability, you're already automatically in a much more output-based system, I would say.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from Dennis Sonmar, who asks, what are the advantages of compiling risk at the European level? What happens if risk, sorry, just have another look at this one. But maybe you could start with that first question. What are the advantages of compiling risk at the European level? And also you mentioned, did you anticipate transboundary responses between some countries?
Well, that's already, I think, the answer. It's already in the second question. So part of the advantage, of course, is simply that you identify basically shared risks. So, for example, in terms of the natural disasters, the number one top risk is always floods. And clearly that's also reflected in the fact that there's actually a specific flood directive at EU level, because that really is in practically every EU member state, not actually everyone, but really the vast majority. So that's something where we can very clearly say, okay, we can work together on this. And then there are the cross-border risks, where it's true that very often, for example, say for forest fires, there's a kind of along the Mediterranean, the countries have been cooperating for a very long time. But then again, you can give it a more, let's say, stronger framework for them to cooperate. And I think also it's again helping countries or bringing them together to do some exchange of best practice and mutual learning. So I think that's always one of the really important aspects for us in that respect.
Thank you. And the final question we have from Bianca, who asks, she recognises that you're evaluating effectiveness at the moment, but what indicators and what kind of data are you using to track that effectiveness? Maybe a bit more information on how you're going to move on, I guess, from considering exactly the existence of a risk assessment to really understand its effectiveness. What's the detail beneath that process?
No, okay. Well, I mean, as I said before, really in the legislation, it's a slightly formalistic approach. We're measuring this objective of improving by the existence of risk assessments, which to some degree I think is already showing some effectiveness, because it shows that somewhere in the member state, somewhere in the system, this process has started of even thinking about risks. Because in the past, very often, a lot of these civil protection systems, they were really very much based around the response. And then a number of member states, particularly in Northern Europe, but not only, they started saying, okay, response is all very well, but really, if we're talking about solidarity, we need to start much earlier. You need to start with prevention. And everybody should be trying to identify and analyze and prevent risks. And then if still something happens that's beyond your capabilities of dealing with, then we are very happy to come and help. So that was a little bit the initial idea, was having this very strong prevention side in the legislation. And I think from that point of view, it's true that simply by checking, do they have this in place, it's already a very good indicator of something in the system having changed, if you like. And then once we go into the detail, I think at the moment it's a little bit up to us, because the legislation doesn't really tell us that much about it. I mean, we have some ideas. We also know, for example, we've got guidelines dating back to 2010, which talk a little bit about how you rank the risks. So in terms of the impact and frequency, for example, this famous risk matrix. So we are encouraging member states to go down that route, so that again things become a little bit more comparable, even though it's quite difficult. And I think then also in future, the sender indicators, that will be hopefully a bit of a game changer, because that should really make a lot more actual qualitative data accessible, which at the moment is usually not there. So ultimately, you're always relying at the moment a little bit on kind of informed self-assessments, let's say. And once we have more data, it will be more objective.
Great, thanks a lot. That's really useful clarification. I'm just conscious of time. At the moment, I think we probably will run over the hour a little bit. I hope everyone's okay to stay with us for 5 or 10 minutes extra, because I know we started a little late. But without further ado, I'd like to thank Laura very much for that presentation and hand over to Paula for the next presentation. Thank you.
So hello, my name is Paula Silva. I'm the Director of Resilience Monitor, a consultancy firm that works on M&E, on adaptation, DRR, and resilience at large. And today I'll be presenting our experiences in BRACE. This is a component of the BRACE program led by ITAT. And the lessons I'll share today are emerged from a report that we recently published. So those interested in this presentation will find further information, and I'll share the link in the last slide. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the BRACE program, so I thought that before going into the crux of the M&E system, I'll give you a bit of a background, just to provide a bit of not just context, but the scale of the M&E system and how we are looking at resilience. BRACE is a DFID-funded program of 110 million, and It works across, excuse me, 13 countries and 15 projects, and it brings together over 120 organizations working in consortia to deliver resilience-specific, looking at climate change and disaster projects. These projects were designed and set up before a knowledge manager was in place. So each project has developed its own monitoring and evaluation frameworks and indicators. And this was one of the main challenges when looking at it from a program level perspective. And I think this is the interesting insight from our work, is how do we move from projects to programs, and how do we monitor and evaluate at scale. So along with the implementing partners working across these 14 projects, we have a knowledge manager, as I just mentioned, and a fund manager. And I think this is a really important discussion from an M&E perspective. On the one hand, we have the fund manager that is responsible for overseeing delivery and performance of these projects led by KPMG. And then we have the knowledge manager that focuses on building an evidence base on what works and what doesn't when projects aim to build resilience to climate streams and disasters, to share that knowledge within a BRACE but also outside BRACE, and inform policies and future programming. And within that, as you can see, there are different aspects within the knowledge manager, although all these organizations have the common goal of improving what we know about what works in resilience building. And monitoring and evaluation plays a critical role, not just in providing that evidence and analyzing the data, but also in actually learning about M&E for resilience building, especially at the program level, but also working closely with implementing partners to know what the challenges are when talking about resilience. And I'm sure you are all aware about, recent debates about indicators, what constitute resilience, and how indicators should be picked and reported. So within this context, we have the knowledge manager has set up an M&E infrastructure, and I think it's important to be aware today that I will be presenting the findings of one particular aspect. As I mentioned before, we have the fund manager looking at the performance and delivery of implementing partners' progress. But on the other hand, we have a monitoring and results reporting function and an evaluation function that are closely interlinked and feed each other, but with different angles and lenses and timing of data collection. I will not go in detail through this slide, but this is just to give you a flavor of the different methods and activities that a program at this scale requires to not just track performance, but to really understand what works, what doesn't, and what are the implications. The aim of the M&E team is to address different questions from effectiveness to results, but with special emphasis on processes and program and design and theories of change, and how there is little we know still about this kind of programs, and therefore very strong learning lens in the questions we aim to answer. And as I said, I will be focusing on the monitoring and results reporting. That's the team I lead, and how we are looking at not outcomes and processes, but I also would like to share with you the process we followed to put the M&E system in place and the frameworks that we are using. And this is the overarching question for the results reporting team. Also, as a bit of a background, this is an exercise that we do on an annual basis, and this was a decision that was made on, based on the understanding that change is something that takes time, and that reporting and collecting data on monthly basis or quarterly basis may be too much in terms of time and resources, and that doing this kind of exercise on an annual basis will not only enable us to reduce the burden on implementing partners, but also to make sure that relevant data and processes were captured. And this is what the process we followed. As I mentioned, these projects were in place before the knowledge manager M&E structure was developed, and therefore the process we had to follow was to look at across all the M&E frameworks of each project, their theories of change, the log frames, and come up with an overarching theory of change and log frame that spoke to and that was relevant to all these different projects. So it was very much a bottom-up process. This enabled us to find some common ground across 15 projects. Just needless to say, they work in very different contexts, different realities. They all have the overarching aim of building resilience, but in different countries, resilience is defined differently. What matters and what is important for communities also differs. So an overarching theory of change and log frame enabled us to find some common ground and to be able to speak to each other through a common language. The added value of the knowledge manager was to develop then 3 qualitative frameworks, as especially the log frame mostly capture quantitative indicators, and I'll share with you just in a second. And we also provided light touch M&E support. One of the challenges that we have right from the beginning is that this area of M&E is relatively new. We are all testing new ideas and frameworks, and it was really important to make sure that implementing partners were on board, but also have the understanding and capacity to implement those. And the final step in the process was the aggregation and the synthesis. So mid last year, we received implementing partners' annual reports, and we have just published the first synthesis that looks across all the data and comes up with key findings and conclusions and recommendations. Again, I'll share the link of this presentation at the end. But overall, I think what this slide, the key message is that it has been a long process. It took us almost over a year to set up the frameworks, the templates, the indicators, building capacity, understanding, etc. So it wasn't a 2-day exercise, and I think this is a very important lesson around the timing, the time it takes to build an M&E system for a program at this scale, and the resources, and therefore raises questions about when should an M&E system and framework be set up, and what process it should follow. When analyzing the project's theories of change in log frames, I'm trying to think what kind of frameworks would enable us to analyze data across different contexts and types of projects. I think that some projects focus on providing financial services. Other projects have a more DRR lens. Other projects have more of a adaptation and longer term dimension, etc. So there is a wide variety, not just in terms of context, but also in terms of the activities. From the donor perspective, there were from the beginning 2 mandatory indicators. You can see them at the bottom. So at the outcome level, we have KPI 4. That is the number of people whose resilience has improved as a result of the project. And at the output level, we have the number of people supported by BRAC to cope with effects of climate change. Now, as you can see, from a perspective of trying to understand what works and what doesn't, these 2 mandatory indicators that all implementing partners report against provided us very little understanding of what lies behind that number of people, what resilience means, how it has been measured and aggregated. And therefore, our first step was trying to unpack resilience at the outcome level, but also what we mean by support to cope with. So to that end, we took a theory of change approach and asking the following questions. So, what is the change we want to see? This, addressing the resilience and what we mean by the term. And here we are using the 3A's framework. I'm not sure how many of you are aware. This framework was developed also as a result of BRAC with our partner, the Overseas Development Institute, and enables us to define more specifically resilience around 3 capacities: anticipatory, absorptive, and adaptive. So this framework already enables us to bridge in a way the sectoral divide between disaster risk reduction and adaptation, as resilience is understood through these 3 capacities, of course, anticipatory and absorptive, looking very much at the DRR and preparedness side, and the adaptive looking more at the long-term adaptation process. We are also testing transformation as an indicator of resilience building projects, but it will take me a while to talk you through this. If you have questions, I can address them later on. But just to say that at the outcome level, we are using the 3A's framework. Then it's not only important to understand from our perspective what resilience looks like and how we measure it, but also what are the processes that implementing partners are following to achieve or to contribute to resilience building efforts. And therefore, we put a strong emphasis on the how and who are the key actors involved in the process. So we could unpack, the black box between the output and the outcome, and the number of people being supported and the number of people who actually their resilience levels have been improved. For this one, we developed another. I don't know what I've done. Another template, which we are calling the areas of change, understanding that in order to build resilience, in order to strengthen those 3 dimensions of capacity, we need to address knowledge gaps and improve knowledge and capacity, influence decision-making processes so they become more inclusive, and there is a need to work through partnerships to deliver projects that actually address so many different issues. So, for example, you will see projects working with 20 or more partners, from climate information providers to researchers to the private sector to civil society organizations. And therefore, for us, it was important to understand how those partnerships are actually working together, how effective they are, and how they contribute to improve results. Another key aspect of the theory of change is the importance of context. And context, not only the climatic context and how the communities that implementing partners are working with respond to and react and are affected by a particular disaster or climate extreme event, but also the no-climatic context, those other projects working in that similar area, the social and cultural norms, the governance systems, and trying to understand how resilience is being built in that particular context and what are the drivers of change or the constraints, if any. And finally, all this analysis and data aims to answer and to test the BRAC theory of change, and therefore contribute to the knowledge generation about what actually works and what doesn't. As you can see, these are very detailed frameworks trying to complement to very new quantitative indicators, and it requires not just capacity building, but also the time to collect the data and to reflect about the data and to analyze that data. So in this process, what have we learned? Well, not surprisingly, we realized when we received the implementing partners annual reports was that on the one hand, their report they use has a log frame driven section where they report against their milestones. And then they have this second section, as I was saying, trying to answer all the questions that I just that I just shared. And it was very obvious to us that only with part one, only with that log frame reporting, we would not have had access to the data and the understanding that we've managed to have today. For example, some implementing partners reported outcome level change, and you may see there within the log frame that 1.1 million people have improved their resilience levels. That what does that number tell us? Whereas in part two, implementing partners had the opportunity to explain what that number meant. When saying resilience, we could see the difference in terms of progress against absorptive, anticipatory, and adaptive capacity. It has been very clear that there is a time dimension in theories of change and implementation of projects, and moving from preparedness, risk reduction, and adaptation. And it has already raised some questions around what's the time frame, or what time frame should these projects have to actually achieve progress across the three capacities. I'm not sure if I mentioned that these are three-year projects. So these projects in 3 years are expected to report changes at the outcome level, but we can already see that actually we may not see outcome level change when talking about adaptive capacity, for example. I'm sure that those of you who have engaged in these kind of processes, you would have realized that how different this is from more standard reporting efforts, and therefore it does require not only the resources and the capacity, but also a shift in mindset. For many years, organizations have been used to report against the log frame, to aggregate data, and sometimes to provide, case studies or examples of good practice, so to speak. But these kind of exercises requires a much more emphasis on learning and reflection. And therefore, these 4 lessons are interlinked. If we acknowledge and accept that we need this kind of qualitative and explanatory frameworks, then we also need to move beyond log frame reporting, which leads us to the third lesson, which are, so how do you go about it? How do you roll out this kind of frameworks and reporting templates at scale? So you can have, some of the global initiatives, more of a top-down approach, where quantitative indicators are decided and standardized across, and then countries report against those, which we believe that in the context BRACE is working with is extremely challenging, because you may miss all the nuances and critical information that is so context specific. Or on the other hand, you can follow more of the bottom-up approach, which is the one BRACE has followed, but then that also has trade-offs, because then you have to decide how much time and resources you want to put in capacity building, standardization, etc. And that's a decision that at the program level needs to be taken, and each comes with its own trade-offs. And finally, again, if we accept that we need qualitative and explanatory frameworks, if we move beyond log frame driven and start thinking around what learning-oriented M&E frameworks can be put in place, if there is a negotiation and a discussion about what are the trade-offs and what are the investments that are required for M&E, then the final lesson is very, very practical, because it takes implementing partners time and resources to collect and analyze the data, but also when all that data is received and a program level synthesis is required, that also becomes a extremely challenging task. It's not simply about adding up numbers, but it's about using robust methodologies for analyzing data in a way that is relevant and meaningful. And as a result, the lead time in between, data is collected, it's analyzed, and then reported is, it's longer than traditional aggregation processes, and therefore the chances for real-time learning and course correction are limited, because by the time you finish the aggregation, the synthesis, and the data, you have had 5-6 months gap in between, and the data that, the analysis you've done may not be relevant anymore if you are working in extremely volatile context where things are changing almost on day-to-day basis. So in terms of practice, and both for BRACE and, I believe from other programs, is this important about being very clear about what counts and why from the beginning. Quantitative indicators are very useful because they are, easier to collect, to compare across countries, and to have an overarching idea of progress. And if that's the purpose and that's what matters for a particular program, then that's absolutely fine. But, if what we aim to do is to build an evidence base and better understanding so we can improve performance and policy, then, those kind of quantitative approaches are not enough, and therefore you need to think about different ways of designing your M&E system. In terms of going beyond business as usual, it's not just about log frame versus theories of change, quantitative versus qualitative. It's also about the team you have in place. Most M&E experts working on the field and M&E teams, have been used to collect, survey data and quantitative data. But when it comes to more the qualitative, the reflection, the analysis, the thinking about the stakeholders, you require a new set of skills and time. So therefore, it's important to either, acknowledge the limits of the system, or thinking about how to improve them to make that happen. Similar to what I just mentioned, this idea of pick your framework. So I think the overarching message here is, to accept, to acknowledge and accept what the limitations are based on the purpose of the M&E, on devising indicators, and be aware of the implications, and acknowledging that going, beyond business as usual requires additional resources and capacity. And this idea of, scale and time at the program level, are we ready to invest on these kind of exercises? And again, the answer to that will depend on how you address number 1, number 2, and number 3, and ultimately why you are conducting M&E. And finally, I'd like to share with you a question. I'm sure you may have some questions already, but as a result of the paper we published on this, we raised this question to BRACE and to the world about how complex does M&E need to be for resilience? Because throughout my presentation is this idea of how do you capture the complexity, the nuances, the qualitative processes. And in trying to develop a framework to address those knowledge gaps, you may end up with an extremely complicated process that may not be as relevant or required. So where do we find the balance between capturing complexity and nuances vis-a-vis a user-friendly, effective M&E system? So that's the question that I leave with you. Thank you very much for listening. It's strange to speak to a screen. And here you have the links for both reports. In the process of synthesizing the data, we published the insights from year 1, and there you can see the progress that BRACE has made as a program, the lessons emerging, some of the contextual challenges in different countries, and the accompanying report around lessons from BRACE. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. No, that's a fascinating presentation, really, really interesting, and it's covered a number of the points that sort of bridged a number of the concepts that have been explored in the previous 2, so that was very, very useful. I realise we are running over time, but I do want to just pick on a couple of questions before we all leave. There's a couple of very practical questions, one from Bianca and one from Dennis. Bianca's point was really regarding the difficulties for projects in providing regular monitoring and facilitating evaluation activities, because your presentation showed a lot of different reports and approaches that were being taken, and a lot of data requirements, and how easily could they be met by the local staff, especially if they're mostly quantitative. So that's the first question of a very practical nature, and sort of Dennis builds on that in asking what were the reactions and perceptions of project leaders to this rather different M&E process. How did they see that, and what were the challenges of bringing information together from different sectors?
No, this is a really, really not only interesting but important question in terms of context. As I mentioned at the beginning, the main challenge we had at the program level is that all these different implementing partners had already developed their M&E frameworks and systems and baselines, etc. So it was really difficult to retrofit some of them, or to suggest how their ongoing M&E efforts could actually speak to the broader program level M&E. As you can imagine, from the beginning, there was a bit, I wouldn't say resistance, because there was a wide agreement that this kind of data and analysis is required. But there was a lot of discussion at the beginning about the capacity, the time it requires. Some implementing partners feeling a bit overwhelmed by the task. And you can in the report, there is an annex where we interviewed implementing partners. So over there you will have more specific comments from their side. But definitely at the beginning it was a challenge for them. But the good news was that once they engaged with the templates, the feedback overall has been positive, acknowledging that it takes time and lots of data had to be collected. Most implementing partners reflect back to us saying that it was useful and that it made them think and question aspects of the program that they wouldn't have asked without the templates. So overall, I think it's a mix. We have the good and the bad in terms of the challenges and feeling overwhelmed. People on the field are extremely busy, but they've seen ultimately with this report, they've seen the value of the exercise, and now we are working towards improving and streamlining those templates and making them more intuitive. If you are interested, you will also find the reporting templates and the structure online. So we've made all publicly available, because we also believe that while there is a lot of discussion at the project level, on how you measure resilience at the local level, not much discussion has happened at, how do you do this at scale? So we really want to engage people in the debate, and everything has been made public. So you can have access to the templates and the reporting. And we hope that the relationships with implementing partners in terms of M&E will improve next year once we make the templates as useful and simple as possible. But this refers back to the question I was raising: how do you strike the balance? If we we acknowledge complexity, then we need to capture that complexity in M&E.
Exactly, and I was about to say exactly the same thing. That's exactly where it plays back to that very, very good question you had at the end. There are some other comments. I'm afraid we can't deal with them all now. There was at one point made by Mike Harley just that he just cautions that we mustn't sort of give the impression that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to M&E, and I certainly think that's something that came through Paula, in your presentation, but certainly in the other two as well, especially in the work that I know the European Environment Agency did, was very strong on saying there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So certainly I would reinforce that point. A number of interesting aspects, I think, in your presentation that really sort of dealt with the sort of interface between climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction on this M&E topic. The first of all, you mentioned the 3A's concepts as a sort of way of bridging DRR and CCA, and I think those are really interesting and something that maybe it's worth people looking at that report that specifically is on the 3A's as how that might be useful for both communities. The other thing you mentioned is this very strong learning focus, and I think that's something that is really grown in its emphasis in the adaptation community in the last couple of years, really, and certainly was a key aspect of what came out of Eleni's work as well, was the importance of learning, and that was reinforced then by an OECD report, which again sort of highlighted the importance of this learning. And I really think it's interesting that the split that happened in Braced between the fund management and the knowledge management. And there's a question there, I think, for both communities is, do we need to separate out that learning, that knowledge aspect from the more conventional, I guess, project management style fund management, measuring what we said we'd do rather than asking whether what we said we did was the right thing? Is there a challenge there in the separation of the two functions? So really interesting. I do realise we're probably at our very limit of time now, so I'm going to end this webinar here. I'd like to thank the presenters very, very much for their input, fascinating presentations, and also for all of the participants and attendees for your excellent questions. And hopefully you had managed to log on without too much problem. I noticed there was a few latecomers, may have been a few issues, but hopefully you'll also be able to listen to the recording if you missed any. So we'll make sure that goes on the PLACARD website as soon as we possibly can. So thank you all again for your participation, and have a great day. Thank you very much.